As part of the work that I do on a daily basis, I occasionally write op-eds for the international press, obviously not as often as Hannah, but one of my ideas was to write something entitled Erdogan and Harley Davidson. Now, the reason why I think, I thought that that would be, not only a catchy title, but also something that would be descriptive of the theme that we're going to discuss today, is that there's a small town in Indiana, which is the headquarters of Harley Davidson. And that town voted for Trump by a large majority. Now, how do you square that? Because Trump, before he came, before he got elected, he already told the American public about his economic policies, about his trade policies, about how tough he's going to be vis-a-vis China and the others. And obviously what he said on the trade side was perhaps good for industries and people who were competing against imports, but it was a bad story, a bad narrative for industries that were in the export business. Because, if you're exporting to the rest of the world, and that is what Harley Davidson is doing, then you want open markets. You want a rule-based system. You want to be able to trade freely. So the fact that, people whose livelihood depend on exports in Indiana, where in the small town, voted for Trump is indicative of a phenomenon which I think is very closely linked to Brexit, because this is the second time that I've actually witnessed this. On Brexit, in the Brexit story, the example that we can transpose from Harley Davidson is called Sunderland. That's the place where the Ford factory is, has its production units. And that town also voted for Brexit. So this is a situation where I think we need to sort of unshackle some of our principles about how we view politics nowadays. And this is where I want to start. Because what Brexit taught me, as somebody who is not a UK citizen, but looking at this from, from outside, who has a fair understanding of the international trade regime, about the EU, I initially thought, when this idea was first launched by Cameron, that this is just a ploy to basically cement his leadership of the Tory party, because for long, that particular party had an issue with Europe. So by launching this initiative, I thought that Cameron was doing something smart, because there's no way the Brits were going to vote to exit the EU, so it would be an easy win for him politically at home, and that way he could go back to his grassroots and once for all tell them that the Europe issue is settled for the Conservatives. That you had this vote, the referendum, the people spoke, and the Brits wanted to stay in the EU. That's what I thought initially, because when you try to analyze this on a rational basis, it is very difficult to find an economic argument that makes sense for Brexit. So now, having experienced what we've experienced, we have to go back to our original frame of analysis and try to sort of articulate it differently, because obviously just looking at it from the perspective of rational economics just doesn't take us anywhere. We just couldn't really grasp what was happening if we were looking from that prism. This is also very similar to some of the developments that we see across in actually many other societies, where we see this type of reaction, this populist reaction against what I can for lack of a better word, against the established order. Initially, part of that reaction was, again, and this is a fallacy, which I'm happy to admit, I thought that this was a reaction to globalization. Namely, there were industries, there were people who found that their livelihood had not improved. On the contrary, their job prospects had dwindled, their economic income had decreased. So there was a reaction to what we know and define as globalization. But again, if you view it from that simple lens, there are a number of examples which don't fit that model. One is Austria. You know what happened in Austria? Austria is the country in the EU that, even with Germany, that has the lowest unemployment rate. When they had their presidential elections, the unemployment rate in Austria was 3.8%. It's a society that has a very high level of income, and they were just about to choose a proto-Nazi, the Austrians. The candidate got 49% of the vote. So, obviously, the economic argument in itself also does not explain what we're experiencing, what we're seeing in countries like the UK as well. So there has to be something else to that argument. And that something else, I would argue that it is about culture. So it is, what we see in societies is not only a combination, an alliance between the people who believe that they have been the losers of this phenomenon of globalization, and another segment of society that is now revolting against the rise of liberal values, whether it has to do with immigration, whether it has to do with LGBT rights, whether it has to do with emancipation of women, gender roles, climate, whatever you name it. But there seems to be, indeed, a revolt against those values. So when you dig down about who voted for Brexit and also who voted for Trump, you start to see this exact phenomenon. And that, I think, is something that we missed initially, at least I did, when I looked at, when I initially thought that, putting, Brexit to vote was a smart political move by Cameron. And I think he missed it too. So today, I think when we look at these developments and how we came to the place where we are today, we certainly have to take stock of this. And this is not a temporary phenomenon. Because again, look at Brexit. 2016, the vote happened, and with a very thin margin, the UK electorate voted for Brexit. So then, again, in my naivete, I thought that the UK establishment will find a way to redress the situation. This is a fluke. This is an accident. What do I know? Last elections in the UK, the Conservatives, with the who want to have Brexit, won with a landslide. They won easily. So it's not that the UK establishment or the UK grassroots are actually unhappy with Brexit. On the contrary, it seems that they really want this to happen, and they want to, in a way, basically close that chapter and move on. But there didn't seem to be any sort of recalculation about Brexit, which is what I thought would happen when the vote, with the initial vote. I thought that with that slim margin, at some point there would be, the electorate would come back to its senses, and and then the UK political establishment would find a way to put the vote again to the electorate and get a vote to stay in the EU. That's not what happened. On the contrary, the split, the gap between the ones who want to remain and the ones who want Brexit to happen became even wider. So therefore, this reaction to traditional politics, whether it has to do with globalization of liberal values, is a reaction that is much less superficial than I initially assessed, and definitely more than a temporary phenomenon. Because there's also a generational aspect to this, which I think we need to assess. Again, when you look at the vote, the Brexit vote particularly, but also the Trump vote, you see that very clearly. It's the old people in the UK that essentially, in very crude terms, put an embargo on the lifestyle of the young in the UK by voting for Brexit. Same in the US. It's the old white men that voted for Trump. So that sort of, political reaction is, I think, going to really shape the politics of many countries in the years to come. This is not going to disappear. It's a generational thing. And had the question been about the economy, about how globalization works, I would have been much more comfortable in basically pontificating that, we should get together, and whether it's the G20, WTO, IMF, World Bank, we can find ways to address some of the grievances if the question had been the economy. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. It is because when you enter the realm of these cultural cleavages, there is no easy solution, let alone, I don't know if there is a solution. Because when you're in that sort of world of cultural cleavages, and I think as Turks, we certainly understand what that means, there is no easy way to replicate or to answer political strategies that are based on the deepening of these cleavages. It is very easy to say no to immigration, and you win votes. It is easy to say no to LGBT rights, and you win votes. It's easy to speak against, at least in some societies, against, gender policies, and you win votes. So I think what I want to leave you with, at least for the first round, is based on Brexit, how do we think about an answer to this phenomenon, given that it's not only about economics, but there's also a very deeply felt cultural divide issue here.
I've got one.
Oh, you got yours, sorry.
Let me reflect on a couple of things you mentioned. So the reason, yes, everybody asks this question, why did Brexit happen? It was a big shock and nobody expected it. And Cameron gambled and he lost big time. And the first reaction was, obviously the expectations was the referendum would not come out as leave. And then also the following 3 years, nobody expected the government to go through with it. But obviously it's happening. If we think about the reasons, definitely a reaction to the government plays a big role. But then we also should not forget that the EU fails to communicate to the citizens of the European Union all the advantages it brings to them and actually how they touch their everyday life. And especially in a country like the UK, who's an island and is not in the Eurozone and is not in the Schengen area, so it's more difficult for people to feel those direct impact compared to the European citizens living on the continent. And having said that, if we think about the last elections and the reaction there, another thing that Britain is not used to is uncertainty, and they've been living in uncertainty for 3 years since the referendum in 2016. The first date they had was 29th of March 2019, and then it got postponed, and there were lots of discussions and talks. I mean, Parliament TV, the speaker or the equivalent is in Turkey is the president of the parliament. I mean, he became a celebrity, so everybody was like literally watching at home. Okay, what's going to happen tonight? And was actually getting really involved for the first time ever about what's happening with the future of the country. But another misconception is also that people think that the EU is a book club, or a trade association. I stop going to the meetings, I stop paying my fee, and I'm out of the club. But the EU is much more than that, and this is actually what people have missed realizing, and this is still what the government is realizing. And let me give you a couple of examples. So, and also, please also keep in mind that the UK has been a very strong and influential EU member state for more than 40 years. If you go to a public sector expert or a bureaucrat and ask them, how did you do it before the EU? Nobody knows, because it has changed so much and it's so well integrated into the system in the UK, and the UK is so well integrated into the EU. Even though the UK is known to be Eurosceptic, which is fair, but then they're also a very strong player in the EU decision-making system and are very well integrated and play the game very well. So just think about a country that has been in the Union for 40 years and has played a major role in shaping it, saying all of a sudden, I'm out. So just from the legal perspective, so just to give you a bit of a background information, so in the EU, there are two types, if we simplify everything, there are two types of EU law. One is the EU law, once it's out, it applies to all EU countries. And the other version is the EU directives that will be translated into national law. So for all policy areas, if there is an EU law, there is no national law. So if you decide one day to stop going to the book club, it means that you have absolutely no laws and no legal basis in those areas, and all of a sudden there are massive gaps. So that's why also the UK Parliament has spent hours and hours in sessions trying to pass new laws to make sure that the country can remain operational. So obviously everybody talks about the trade deals and the relationship with the EU, which is very, very important. But there's also the other big question to ask is, what's going to happen to the UK actually? How is it going to operate after leaving the EU? Because we're talking about massive joint IT systems that all EU countries share. We're talking about joint committees and expert pools where they discuss regulations and new laws that will disappear. And they will continue actually being one of the closest neighbours of the European Union and the biggest trade partners. So just saying that, I'll stop, paying my fees, basically does not really answer the question. And therefore, while there is this the questions that the mainstream media is focusing on at the moment, and what the politicians are talking all the time because it's popular, but also in the background, there's a lot happening. And actually trying to do something that nobody has done before, because nobody has left the EU before. You don't know how you can actually replace all those systems and all those decision-making mechanisms. So another example is if the EU makes a law, if there's a decision, maybe you've heard of the different EU institutions and the very complicated decision-making mechanism. So you've got the European Commission, who's kind of the technical body, does all the groundwork, does the technical pieces of the draft bill, the draft law, and of course you've got the European Parliament, who represents the people, and then the European Council, where the member states actually provide comments on the already ready-made proposal, the law, where the European Commission has, I think, around 10 or 20,000 people working there. These are all technical people, and they have actually a broader expert pool that they can rely on when they need public consultations, a very specific information for certain areas, and very specific regulations and laws. So, simplifying all of that, we can say that the UK has been eating ready-made food, putting it in the microwave, and because somebody else was preparing it. I'm not saying that the member states don't do anything. They do influence the EU law and the regulations heavily, but the groundwork, they get a lot of support from the EU institutions while doing that. So this means also you have to rethink the whole process of how are we going to take decisions, how are we going to make laws. And maybe as a final comment, we should also consider that the UK is a union itself. So there are 3 countries England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland, and 4 countries, not 3. And there are lots of there are also policy areas where you know, they are, as they call it, devolved. It's decentralized. The countries decide themselves. But as there is the EU law giving them the framework, they have already identified, established the playing field. So they can't go beyond that. But if the EU framework is gone, then how is the union going to agree on certain terms among themselves? So if it's the rule of thumb is basically in those certain policy areas, they can decide on their own if it's like an internal issue, but if it affects some kind of external issue or trade, then they have to agree on a common policy. But there are many, many issues where actually they might agree to disagree, and they will also have to find define the new rules of the game within their own union. So therefore, I think, yeah, they will have some more books to read before leaving the book club.
Is that on? Yeah. So I'm going to disagree with something that everyone said so far, which is that no one saw it coming. I saw it coming, and that is not because I'm exceptionally bright, but because I was born and was brought up in the heart of Brexit country. So I'm from a place called Lincolnshire. It's north of London. It's almost in what was termed the Red Wall in the latest elections. So this kind of wall of seats or constituencies across the Midlands and Northern England, which have voted Labour since the 1930s and in the last elections went to the Tories. And I can tell you that my family have been talking about Brexit since the 1990s. For as long as I can remember, they've been banging on about leaving the European Union. So when David Cameron called that referendum, I had a sinking sense of doom from the very start. So before UKIP, the UK Independence Party, there was a party called the Referendum Party. You can probably remember it. I remember my family putting up posters for them in the 1990s. So what I will agree with Sinan is that the reason why they were so supportive of Brexit was not particularly rational or to do with economic reasons. It was kind of a gut instinct. Some of the things that I remember my family talking about a lot were the idea that we're ruled from Brussels and we don't make our own laws. I think the opacity of Brussels, the fact that these things happen in the corridors in Strasbourg and in Brussels, and no one really understands what's going on, and they, people in Britain have an idea that it's just, very, very well-paid bureaucrats making decisions for us that we have no say over. Economics does play some part, I think, to an extent, but I think what happened is that obviously the Midlands and the north of England since the 1980s have undergone pretty rapid and wide-scale deindustrialisation. So it lost a lot of the industries that had brought in incomes and decent incomes for many people in those regions, so particularly coal mining, steelworks, those kind of things. They all pretty much went in the 80s and 90s and have been replaced really with nothing. So outside the big cities, you'll find in Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield, you'll find there's been urban regeneration. They're quite nice places to live, quite affluent, but outside those city centres, the small towns are really suffering. Now, that's a structural problem that's completely to do with the UK, not the EU. But what happened when the referendum was called was that national problem was then turned into somehow an EU issue by the people who campaigned for leave. So I think, people who are feeling very forgotten, very frustrated, very overlooked by the decision makers in London suddenly saw their chance to make something of difference. And also the immigration issue. My hometown. Sorry?
Turks.
Not the Turks. No.
For a change.
For a change, not the Turks. Polish. Exactly. Eastern Europe. So the town where I grew up, when I was growing up, it was, I think, in my school there were probably 2 black people, maybe 1 Muslim, and then a few people from Portuguese backgrounds, things like that. I left in 2002 to go to university. In 2004, 3 or 4, Poland the Eastern European states joined. And now 25% of my hometown is people who are born outside the UK. Imagine that speed of change. It's unbelievable. So this is not, I think people like to simplify it and say it's racism. It's not. For example, my mother, who is the most pro-Brexit woman going and who will bitch and whinge about all the newcomers to town, her best friend is an Iranian who came in '79. I remember in the 1990s when Bosnian refugees came and settled in our town, she was the first to go around there, you know, saying hello. So it's not, you know, it's too easy to just say it's racism. But I think certainly that speed of change in terms of immigration plays a massive part in it. And yeah, I wasn't surprised at all when those towns went to the Conservatives in the latest election, partly because of Brexit, partly because they can't stand Jeremy Corbyn. He just doesn't fly in those places. Now, coming to the Turk issue, sort of leaving my personal past behind and looking at it as a journalist, this was incredible to see what the Leave campaign did in 2016. So I'm sure you probably all know the Vote Leave campaign, which said something along the lines of 12 million Turks are going to come to the UK, we'd best leave the EU, which was based on bullshit. I mean, it just wasn't true. So it was I think the source of this claim was some survey where they'd surveyed about 400 Turks and said, where would you like to go? And some of them said, oh yeah, I'd quite like to go to the UK. And then they scaled that up to say 12, yeah, it was this bad. And this was publicised by the man who is now our Prime Minister. This was Boris Johnson's Vote Leave campaign. On top of that, they also employed a firm which is connected to Cambridge Analytica to push these ads via Facebook to people. So actually it wasn't only Turkey, they were also making similar claims about Macedonia, about Serbia, about Bosnia, basically all countries which have got, I can't remember the proper name, but candidate status, so countries which have an aspiration to become EU members. They launched this kind of fear campaign. But I think the reason why it really took off when it came to Turks, to be really frank, I think there is a religion issue there. I think the fact that Turks are Muslim played a big part in that. But for me, it was massively surprising because we don't have the same kind of intercommunal problems with British Turks as you do in, say, Germany. You know, I was really surprised when I first moved to Turkey and started meeting Germans and German Turks who were talking about the kind of community problems that they have there. Because, you know, in Britain, maybe you'll contradict me growing up as a British Turk, but I just don't feel that there's that kind of separation between our communities. Yeah. So it was really shocking for me, actually, to see, firstly, Vote Leave using that, and secondly, to see British people responding to it. So there was a study done by somebody at the LSE in, I think, 2017, and he looked at all the kind of campaigns that had gone on around Brexit, and he said that actually this thing to do with Turks coming to the UK and Turkey's imminent membership might have been the thing that pushed it over the line. I mean, that's absolutely unbelievable. Now, there is a question then of why Turkey's politicians didn't make more of this. I mean, usually your president isn't particularly keen on people who insult his country, but somehow when it came to that, it was all forgotten. Some people would say that's the kind of apparent charisma of Boris Johnson, which I don't see, but some people do. But I think also the fact that the coup attempt in Turkey happened, a month after the Brexit vote, and all of a sudden there was a very different crisis. I think that probably papered over a lot of what might have gone on. But certainly when Boris Johnson, who was then appointed Foreign Secretary, was sent to Turkey to meet with Erdogan a few months later, almost nobody mentioned it, apart from we were asking questions about it, but they seemed to want to smooth it over. So that's my very broad take on what went on.
Can I just share with you an anecdote? At the time of the Brexit debacle, I had a friend in cabinet in number 10. He was advising Cameron. And this summer he shared me the story. He said that basically they had a meeting in the cabinet office where they evaluated what should be the response to these allegations that 70 million Turks will suddenly, migrate to the UK. And one of the people in the room asked Cameron to go out in public to say that he was against Turkey's EU membership. And Cameron refused. Now, of course, he's telling me, had Cameron accepted, they probably would have won the, Brexit referendum. That's what he claims. But because Cameron was, didn't want to renege on the UK promise that, Turkey was eligible to EU membership, he didn't want to go there, and by not going there, they lost the referendum. So that's
giving
something.
a lot of credit to Turks in Brexit referendum.
Yeah, but that's also what Hannah says, that that was one of the arguments that basically was the straw that broke the camel's back. So had they had a more cogent response to this allegation that Turks would suddenly invade the UK, maybe that small margin would not have worked in the favor of the Brexiters. Who knows?
But in general, it was very difficult to say come up with counter-arguments of the Leave campaign, because, there was also this whole, was it 30 million for NHS? What was the campaign number? So it's just, where do you even start? And to come back to the Turkey situation or the issue as well, the foreign secretary at that time was also going live on TV in morning shows and was saying like the EU has accelerated Turkey's accession to the EU and we don't agree with that. So, and where do you start like with that? If you go back to people, no, this is not true, then it's not as punchy as saying like, oh, those are all the risks. And how the populist arguments work, like they're always stronger than telling the truth. So, and of course, this whole perception of Brussels is taking the decisions for us, and then the immigrants. And actually, I was very surprised to listen to all these migration arguments during the Brexit campaign, because it was the UK. The UK was the only country in the EU in 2004 who allowed the people from all new member states to come and work in their country. All the other EU countries waited for 4 years.
Also Sweden.
Sweden as well? Okay. Okay, yes. Okay, so they're the minority, let's put it that way. One of the few countries, correction. You cut that out of the video. So, and then obviously there was a need. And today, again, actually, they're contradicting with this, because now the Home Office is working very hard on keeping the EU citizens in the UK. They've got now videos out and telling the EU citizens, please stay, we love you. And there are even like campaigns by local authorities. If you walk in some of the neighbourhoods in London, you see like big banners, like with a big heart, we love you, please stay. And so there's this massive campaign at the moment in the UK, but obviously it's targeted communication, right? It's not, most of the UK citizens or Brits don't know that, but for the EU citizens, they're like, oh, you should stay, it's very easy. There's this app that you can use with your phone.
There's an app for that.
Yes, there's an app for that. So this is the very, very critical immigration, this difficult immigration system that they have implemented after Brexit for EU citizens. You download an app, so everybody can try. and then, needless to say, they also spend quite some money to develop it. And then if you've got the right phone, you just register, and then you put your passport on top of it, and it extracts all the information from the chip. So you don't even have to go to Home Office or your local authority or anything. And in a couple of weeks, you've got your status, and they don't even give the residence cards. They say like, that's it, so you're in the system, you're fine, and you keep all your rights. And they're campaigning for this because they do need the people. So there's a lot of contradiction going on, but obviously, that's all a little bit behind the scenes. It's very targeted and very strategic. And obviously, while Boris Johnson is now going through with the deal and the negotiations, obviously nobody's talking about it. And I'm expecting actually more of these to come when they're talking about the real, the main deal and all those tiny details nobody will see, and then they will realize, that looks like customs union, but we don't name it like that. I mean, maybe we don't know.
Just coming back to Cameron, not sort of coming out and saying, no, I'm against Turkey. I mean, I think the thing is Cameron was always very, very pro-Turkey joining the EU, as was Britain generally, right? I mean, I think one of the kind of knock-on effects for Britain leaving the EU is it's going to rob Turkey of its best ally, actually. I mean, how much Turkey still wants to join the EU at this point, I don't know. Politically, certainly not.
In the polls, there's still quite, overriding support for EU membership.
What percentage?
It oscillates, but it's always above 50. I mean, it's 50,
Especially
55.
Young people are very much pro.
Except that, again, in the same polls, when you ask people, the question about whether you believe Turkey will join, then it drops down to 10, 20%.
Yeah.
There's support for membership.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's inevitable. I mean, I can't see Turkey sort of moving on with membership at any sort of time.
That might be the topic of a different panel.
We're talking about leaving, not joining.
But yeah, I mean, I think by the time that Vote Leave launched that campaign, saying all these Turks are going to come to the UK, the irony was that by that time, Davutoglu had struck this deal with Merkel to get visa-free access to the Schengen zone for Turks, and it was part of the refugee deal of early 2016. But in fact, that deal that agreement started falling apart almost as soon as it was signed. And by the time that it got to the final weeks before Brexit, that was completely abandoned. I mean, even what Vote Leave was saying about, Turkey's membership has been speeded up, which was completely untrue. But if you sort of take them at their word, visa-free access has been speeded up. Even that had fallen apart. Maybe nobody had said as much, but anyone who was watching Turkey knew that just wasn't going to happen. I don't know. I mean, I think Cameron probably should have come out and sort of tried to make the facts clear, but then whether that would have made any difference. I think, with the bus claim about, 3 billion extra a week to the NHS, I think, people unpicked that pretty much straight away, but it made no difference because,
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that we discussed is, Paul, the sort of the history of Brexit. But perhaps a few minutes on, what's going to happen next. Now, we discussed it from the UK perspective, but I'm a Turkish citizen, so I think it's worth to say a few things from Turkish perspective, which actually looks different. I agree with you that the fact that Turkey has lost one of its main ally in the EU is going to be a handicap. But the other side of the coin, and when you ask many people who deal with EU issues generally, there is a somewhat hidden, sometimes less hidden aspect to this in Turkey. Some people are happy that the UK is leaving. They're happy perhaps because their worldview is that in any case the European Union is collapsing, the Western civilization is sinking. See Brexit. That's one worldview. So they use Brexit to substantiate the argument that the EU has no future, the Western civilization is in decline, it's all about, Russia, China, and so on. So that's one. Obviously, I'm not part of that camp. But there's a second view, which is that now that the UK is leaving, we could actually think more strategically about a Turkey-UK partnership as two very similar countries. And what I mean by similar is that, when you look at Europe's relationship with its close neighborhood, there is a model, outside the EU. The closest model is the EEA model. But the countries in the EEA are not exactly very similar to the UK and Turkey when you have Liechtenstein and, Norway perhaps, but Switzerland, those countries. So Turkey and the UK, first they have a imperial heritage. And I think you already mentioned some of that in the reaction of the UK people to all this decision making being done in Brussels and so on. So there's a pride and a need that decision making should be closer. And all of this historically very vibrant debate in the UK about sovereignty sharing, we have the same in Turkey. You know, even though we sort of like the idea of Turkey joining the EU, we're still quite perplexed as to how sovereignty sharing would work in that environment. Oh my God, other people will get to say about how, you know, how we're going to rule our own country. So there's that sort of element which ties into this imperial heritage. Secondly, of course, the UK, both economically but also militarily, is one of the most important countries in the EU. So the UK walking out, and after having walked out, the type of relationship that it will build with the EU, there will be a relationship. There will be a relationship on the trade side. There will be a relationship on, you know, on defense side. So that model, that blueprint, could actually be very useful for Turkey, because, for instance, we have many problems with the EU where the EU refuses to take the intellectual leap to address our grievances. That's the case for the customs union, for instance, where we are subject to EU trade policy without having a say at the table. But that's also a case for security and defense, because Turkey, as a NATO ally, wants to have a bigger say and bigger participation in EU defense, but all doors are closed because we're not a EU member. The hope here, you know, in Ankara, is that with the UK, some of that intellectual obstacles will come down, because the EU will want to answer more positively the UK's demands. They would want the UK to continue to contribute to EU defense. They would want the UK to have some sort of bigger anchoring in the EU trade policy. So whatever, that will push the EU policymakers to think more constructively about these issues, about how they are going to associate a big country to the EU. This is not Iceland, this is not Liechtenstein. So those answers will help Turkey in its own negotiations with the EU, if indeed the future for Turkey is not one of membership, but something of a close association a la UK. So in that sense, the blueprint, there's very keen interest in Ankara to understand what the UK will be doing now that Brexit has happened, or is happening.
How do you see the trade relationship with the UK and Turkey while Turkey is in the customs union, if we assume that the UK remains out? Because it was one of the questions that really popped in my mind when Boris Johnson was in Turkey as Foreign Secretary, and it was on Financial Times, so we can't wait to negotiate our new deal with Turkey. And I'm like, he must know something that I don't know. Well, I hope he does, but...
Well, I mean, there's a relatively easy answer to that.
Yeah.
But we first have to know what's going to be the trade arrangement between the UK and the EU. Assuming it's not a customs union, and assuming that obviously, you know, the UK will not stay in the single market, there will be an FTA between the UK and the EU.
Yeah.
And therefore the answer is Turkey will have its own FTA with the UK as well. So that
through
seems
the customs
logical.
union, yeah.
Once the EU has Turkey can have an FTA once the EU has an FTA with a third country. So assuming the EU will have an FTA with the UK, there is no obstacle to Turkey having its own FTA with the UK as well. So I think that's the direction that we're going. The only thing there is that I think so far, from what I understand, the UK authorities have been very resistant to the idea of starting negotiations with Turkey on an FTA, despite what Boris Johnson said. But I think that's the wrong approach, because there is nothing that prevents negotiations to start. The only obstacle is that the potential FTA between Turkey and the UK cannot enter into force before the UK-EU FTA enters into force. That's the only limitation. but negotiations we can start tomorrow. Or that I think that has to sink in with the British policymakers, because they've been resistant to this.
Yeah,
Maybe because there's no bandwidth in London. I know.
Yeah, exactly. I think they also, don't have the capacity at the moment, because everybody is working on Brexit at the moment. So it's I think one of the things that the UK will realise, or has started realising, is also people think that Brexit is an event and it will go away, and it's once there's a deal, and then there will be negotiations, and obviously it will be a whole FTA will be done in a year, and normally free trade agreements are actually done product or category or industry based, so you renegotiate everything separately because there are different tariffs, and it's very difficult to do a one bulk negotiation for everything. So that's why I'm very skeptical about where the big deal or the future economic partnership will get by the end of the year. And also a free trade agreement does not mean borderless trade. So, and at the moment people don't realize that what it means, that your goods have to wait at the border, that you have to have a border inspection, and you have to actually set it all up and design all or redesign all your supply chain and logistics accordingly, because there will be delays, there will be extra costs. And so the most of the discussions I witness goes like, once there's a deal, it will be fine, everything will be okay. Whereas when you talk to some of the industries, once I heard a very interesting discussion with the industry exporting live animals, and one of the questions was like, what about the hatching eggs? And I'm like, what about them? Well, there will be chicklets once when they wait at the border. Well, actually they should come out on the other side of the border. So, and obviously it's a massive risk for the industry. And I was like, okay, all those details we have to think about when you talk about the trade. And so those are like really minor examples and questions popping here and there, but it is really much more complex than just we'll agree on something and everything will be fine.
And actually, we think a lot about the trade aspect, which is obviously very important, given that a number of Turkish manufacturers' main export market is the UK. Companies like Arçelik and others have a very significant market share in the UK, so they're very interested in that. But let me take you somewhere else, something that we haven't really fully grasped, and that is that once the UK leaves, there is a whole acquis, that now applies to the UK by virtue of Turkey's own Ankara Agreement and the additional protocol that binds all EU members. Once the UK leaves, that acquis will not anymore apply between Turkey and the UK. So some of the examples that we'll suddenly face, one of them I can already share with you. That acquis was used in the past, and for those who are a Fenerbahçe fan, I think you'll like this story. There was a goal player in Fenerbahçe called Rüştü. And about a decade ago, he got transferred to Barcelona. And in Barcelona, the trainer didn't give him play time because they considered him as a non-EU player, and therefore he was stuck with the quota of non-EU players. Then Rüştü went to court in Barcelona and claimed, on the basis of an association council decision dating back to 1980, that as a Turkish citizen who is legally employed in an EU country, he cannot be discriminated vis-à-vis EU citizens. So he has to have the same rights as EU citizens once he's employed legally. So the court, found that, and then Rüştü then started to play in Barcelona as, on the same basis as a Spanish player or a European player. That's how he got playtime. So now let's take this. If a Turkish player would be, transferred to Chelsea, he couldn't use this argument anymore. He would be viewed as a non-British, non-EU player, and therefore, So this is just one simple aspect of how things are going to change in ways that we're not even aware of after Brexit.
I think one thing that my Turkish friends always ask me here, and you might be able to answer this, is what's going to happen with immigration? So, on the plus side, perhaps once we leave the EU, Turks all of a sudden will be on the same footing as everyone else. They won't suddenly be at the back of the queue. But is that necessarily going to be the case?
So you're referring to Turkish people who migrated to the UK based on the EU association agreement, or
no, who want to, or who even want to visit the UK. So even to visit the UK as a Turk at the moment, it can be really, really tricky actually to get a visa. So the question that I've been asked by quite a few Turks is that going to change once?
No, actually nothing changes for Turkish people because the UK has its own immigration system anyway. So basically, they're not in the Schengen zone, so you apply for the UK visa, and therefore this will remain the same.
But the Ankara agreement.
But exactly. But then when you come to the migration side, the EU association agreement, as known as the Ankara agreement, will obviously not be applicable in the UK anymore. But the Home Office is already working on a replica, like they do everything else that's implemented by the EU. Apparently, there will be slight changes, but the principle will remain the same. Having lived, in the continent, for a decade as a Turkish person, and then moving to the UK, I think there is a massive difference between how Turkish people are treated in Britain. So I feel like, finally, I'm not the worst immigrant. It goes further down after me. And therefore, I find the UK immigration system very pragmatic. So if you can show that you can actually contribute to the system and can work, it's very open, and I think this will continue. And even towards the EU citizens, their Home Office is at the moment very welcoming. So I don't expect it to change too much for the Turkish citizens. And if anything changes, my opinion is that it's not going to change based on Brexit, but obviously, based on this, conservative government and where they want to take the UK to. So Brexit might be maybe an excuse, but at the moment, if you look at it from a legalistic point of view, so there's no reason for anything to change, actually. So.
It's really interesting. One of my really good friends has literally just moved to London about 3 or 4 months ago under the Ankara Agreement. And it's really interesting to hear her talk about Britain because to her it's still the most liberal, open place in Europe. And I think a lot of the time when you're a Brit and you're sort of very gloomy about things, and gloomy about the direction of travel, it's quite easy to lose sight of the fact that, okay, it's not perfect, but definitely in terms of attitudes towards Turks specifically and Muslims more generally, it's far more open than somewhere like France or Germany. Yeah. I was reading a really interesting study. I can't remember where it's from, but there's a very good British academic called Matthew Goodwin. He writes in the Sunday Times every week, and he studies populism and nationalism. And he wrote a column this week untangling this claim that one of the reasons why Harry and Meghan Markle are fleeing Britain is because of racism. And he really broke it down, and post-Brexit racism particularly. And he really broke it down. And there was one really interesting statistic in it, which is people's attitudes to immigration before and after Brexit. And actually, people now are far more open to immigration than they were before Brexit. And one of the theories around this is that actually Brexit has acted as a little bit of a safety valve. So all these kind of resentments and tensions that have been growing up for a long time, especially since 2004 with the influx of Polish plumbers, to kind of put it really bluntly, but that's kind of been released somewhat. And, just the very fact that Brexit was voted for, even though it hasn't happened yet, and even though we've been in a mess, has given people some kind of feeling that they have got a little bit of control back. And now they're sort of reining in those sort of really sort of quite nasty attitudes that we saw just before the vote.
He has been actually, apparently he was very optimistic about it, because at the moment there's still a lot of fear about hate crimes, like increase of hate crimes and public tension, especially when the country was preparing for a no deal. And it was, top on the risk registers, like, okay, how do we react? Because, if there's no deal, and also, we also still consider, like, it is highly possible that, it's not highly, it's one of the possibilities that there's no deal. And at the end, by the end of the transition period, by the end of 2020, the UK leaves the EU, without a special deal. It's not very likely, but it's still a possibility. So, and this means that, there might be food shortages and there might be medical shortages. And obviously the government is preparing, to mitigate those risks, but those are still risks. And one of them was actually increase of hate crimes and public tension, actually, because we have seen that the Brexiteers have been very vocal, and sometimes it was not only about Brexit, but everything that was linked to it, that was also linked to racism and hate. That was actually coming out more, because with a government that backs Brexit, they felt like, okay, now we can talk about it. Now we've got the, the legitimate government, and this is what we want. And even though Brexit does not stand for that. So it's now with the, this was also one of the reasons actually that a lot of people voted for the Tory government in the last elections, and some of the people who did not vote before, because in Britain it's not obligatory, they went out and voted because they were just fed up with, the uncertainty. And obviously Boris Johnson was the only one who had a clear answer about what he wants to do with it. And then obviously now there's a bit, it's a bit more smoother, like, okay, now we have a date and hopefully we will keep it. And then there is this, future trade agreement in the future.
My issue with that uncertainty agreement, and maybe we should turn to the floor at some point, is that if that is the case, if the Brits, abhor uncertainty, then why the hell did they vote for Brexit? Because that's the original uncertainty. I mean, if you have a disinclination to uncertainty, why would you go down the path of Brexit with a totally, uncertain future about how the UK will, what's going to happen with Brexit? Initially, when you go back to the 2016s, all these claims about, NHS getting £400 million a week, and all of these absurd claims. But in reality, when you go back then, there was no real single intelligent answer to the question of, okay, then what's going to be the UK's relationship with Europe after Brexit? There are all these, disparate claims: will stay in the single market, but won't accept the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. Yes, we'll accept it, but partially. No, we won't be in the customs union. Yeah, well, yes, we'll be in the customs union. All of these things from the Brexiters. So if there is indeed a reaction to uncertainty, that should have already happened in 2016 with people not voting for Brexit, but that's not what happened.
Absolutely. But first of all, it comes back to the book club. So this is how it was, presented to them. So it was like, okay, actually Brussels or the EU was more uncertain for them. We don't have control over our country. There are people that we don't know. Somewhere in Brussels they're taking decisions about our country. So, and once we're out, everything will be perfect, and we will have, control back, because they thought, it's this, trade association or, whatever association. Once we stop going to the meetings and stop paying the fee, it will be all fine. So nobody really knew actually what Brexit meant, including the Brexiteers. And it's always to say like, oh, we want out, and then everything will go back to how it was before. But before was more than 40 years ago, and things have changed. And that's why also people got even more frustrated, because they were like, we were in the EU, we want to get out. why is this so complicated? And the reaction was even like, oh, it's so easy, and the government can't, get it through. So it's Theresa May, can't pull through, and actually, it's a basic thing. And then that's why they were very happy when Boris Johnson came out and said, like, we either exit or I die in a ditch. So, because for him, it's black and white. He's like, we'll exit. So, and you go like, really? Wow. So, and this gives, obviously, this is what people want to hear. And this sounds like more certainty, and obviously it gets all the votes.
I totally agree, and I'd also add, I think until 2016, Brits were really politically arrogant. There was this sense that this is Britain, we're somehow different, we're somehow exceptional, nothing ever really goes too wrong here. We're far too sensible for chaos, we're far too sensible for crisis. Like, no, we've got this sorted. And I think if anything good can come out of the last 3 years, I hope we've been humbled. I hope that now Brits realise that we're not immune from complete chaos. I mean, the country's been in chaos for the past 3 years.
Absolutely.
I started as a journalist in Britain, and the standard thing then was you leave to somewhere more exciting. But for the past, so I end up in Turkey. But for the past 3 years, Britain's just been insane. Like you say, people tuning in to watch the Parliament. Like, what's that?
Now you can buy T-shirts with Barco on it.
Are you joking? I mean, that's terrible. You shouldn't have exciting politics. I hope it goes back to being really dull in Britain. I hope that's what we've learned.
That's why actually I had really good conversations when I was working in the central government on one of the Brexit projects, and the negotiations are going on. There's like a total chaos, and then I had a portfolio that was linked to trade and everything, and then I was still going to work every day like, good morning, how are you? And people are like, how can you be so calm? And then in my head I was saying like, well, I grew up with this, and then to them I was like, well, I don't let the everyday politics interfere with my work, so, which is true. But then obviously being Turkish, you're born with the immunity to to politics, and I mean, I have to admit that I did enjoy the Parliament discussions. Well, if you haven't watched it, they're amazing compilations on YouTube. I would highly recommend. You will enjoy it, and then buy a T-shirt.